December 26, 1944. The mountains of northern Italy lay under a suffocating blanket of fog and frost. From his stone bunker on Monte Belvedere, Oberst Heinrich von Schellenberg adjusted his field glasses, watching shadowy figures emerge from the mist below. His adjutant had briefed him that morning with a sneer. "Negro troops, Herr Oberst. Former porters and servants. The Americans send us their weakest men." To the German High Command, this assault was supposed to be a farce. To the men climbing those frozen slopes, it was a reckoning. Before him marched the 370th Infantry Regiment, a part of the U.S. Army's 92nd Infantry Division, an entirely black unit fighting under the flag of a segregated America. They were about to assault one of the most fortified positions in the European theater, the Gothic Line, Germany's last major defensive wall in Italy. Wehrmacht propaganda had long mocked black troops as cowardly, biologically unfit for combat. Nazi ideology, obsessed with racial hierarchy, classified them as subhuman auxiliaries fit for labor, not for battle. But that morning, on the snow-bitten ridges of the Apennines, von Schellenberg was about to learn that racial theories crumble faster than concrete bunkers when tested by courage. The men advancing toward Monte Belvedere carried burdens heavier than their rifles, the weight of proving an entire race's worth to a nation that barely recognized them as equals. They had endured segregated barracks, outdated weapons, and commanding officers who doubted their every move. Yet they marched not only toward the enemy, but toward redemption and recognition. Within 48 hours, von Schellenberg would radio an urgent report to Field Marshal Kesselring's headquarters, one that shattered years of Nazi certainty. The message was simple: Negro troops have broken through. They fight with exceptional ferocity. The laughter in the German lines died in the mountains that week. The 92nd Infantry Division, activated in October 1942 at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, consisted of 15,000 black soldiers organized into 4 regiments. Their shoulder patch bore a black buffalo, honoring the legendary frontier soldiers who once protected settlers and built the American West. But their pride ran headfirst into a wall of institutional racism. The U.S. Army remained segregated by law and tradition. Black soldiers trained separately, slept separately, and ate separately. Many of their white officers came from the Jim Crow South, carrying prejudice as naturally as sidearms. Private First Class Vernon Baker later recalled, "They told us straight-up colored soldiers couldn't fight, couldn't lead, couldn't take pressure, so we trained twice as hard to prove them wrong. We knew we'd get half the credit, but we'd take it." Training under the Arizona sun was brutal temperatures over 110 degrees, endless drills, and defective equipment. Many carried World War I-era rifles with cracked stocks and jammed bolts. "They gave us the worst of everything," wrote Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter Jr., "but we'd be ready anyway. We had to be." Even off base, humiliation followed them. In nearby towns, black soldiers in uniform were denied service at cafes where captured German prisoners dined freely. They were preparing to fight fascism abroad while facing segregation at home, a contradiction that burned deeper than any wound. By mid-1944, the 92nd received orders for Italy. Their mission: break the Gothic Line, a 200-mile system of fortifications stretching from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic. Field Marshal Kesselring had spent 2 years carving this monster into the mountains. 2,300 machine gun nests, nearly 500 anti-tank positions, miles of barbed wire, and minefields so thick that even birds avoided them. The Buffalo Soldiers would face this with inadequate artillery, limited air cover, and the knowledge that failure would confirm every racist slur written about them. When they arrived in Naples that July, they were met by General Edward M. Almond, a Virginian whose racial views were well known. He distrusted his own troops and made little effort to hide it. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens remembered his words before deployment. "The general told us people were watching. What he meant was people were waiting for us to fail. That was all the motivation we needed." By late 1944, the Allies were desperate. The Gothic Line had repelled, repeated assaults, winter was closing in. General Mark Clark needed a breakthrough before snow locked the front for months. The 92nd Division was given the western sector, steep terrain dominated by Monte Belvedere, 3,830 feet above sea level. From there, German artillery could see 50 miles in every direction, turning valleys into death traps. Von Schellenberg's men had spent months perfecting their defenses. Concrete bunkers with 3-foot walls, interlocking fields of fire, mine belts, and camouflaged mortar pits. "The Americans would need wings to reach us," wrote Lieutenant Hans Becker in a letter home. "The Negro troops they send will die before touching our wire." That was the last letter Becker ever wrote. December 26th, 1944, 5:45 hours. Darkness swallowed the slopes of Monte Belvedere. Men of Company C, 370th Regiment, checked their gear one last time. Frost bit their fingers as they tightened straps and whispered final prayers. Each man carried over 60 pounds, climbing where even mountain goats struggled. "Stay low until the artillery stops," Sergeant Carter told his men. "Watch for mines. When we reach the wire, torpedoes first. Follow me. If I go down, the next man takes over." At 6, thunder rolled through the valley. 2,400 American shells screamed into the mountain, their full artillery allotment. In his bunker, von Schellenberg smiled. "Only 15 minutes?" he scoffed. "They are weaker than I thought. The Negro troops are coming." When the shelling stopped, silence lasted 30 seconds. Then a single voice broke the cold air. "Move out!" And the Buffalo Soldiers began their climb toward the guns, toward history. The slopes of Monte Belvedere were almost vertical, slick with ice and deathly silent, except for the crunch of boots and the occasional gasp for breath. Soldiers clawed at the mountain with gloved hands, using roots and jagged rocks to pull themselves upward. The angle reached 45 degrees in places so steep that rifles had to be slung over shoulders, both hands gripping stone to keep from sliding backward. Private James Hicks described it later. "You'd climb 10 steps and your legs would burn like fire. Your breath froze before it left your mouth. You couldn't feel your hands, but you kept going because stopping meant the man behind you would die." Then, at 6:23 a.m., the mountain erupted. The German MG-42 seconds opened fire, spewing 1,200 rounds a minute each burst, slicing through the fog like lightning. Company C's lead platoon went down first, 400 yards from the summit. There was nowhere to hide, no trenches, no cover, just open slope. Bullets snapped past ears and ricocheted off rocks, the sound a metallic scream echoing down the valley. "Keep moving," shouted Sergeant Carter. "They can't hit what's moving." The words became a mantra, screamed through the gunfire as men advanced one by one, crawling, falling, climbing again. Mortar shells whistled overhead and detonated among the ranks, sending shards of frozen soil skyward. Yet the Buffalo Soldiers didn't retreat. They fought with the precision and coordination their white officers had said they were incapable of mastering. At 6:47, they reached the first wire barrier, a 30-foot-deep obstacle laced with mines. Bangalore torpedoes went forward, carried by trembling hands. One spark, one wrong step, and everything would vanish in a fireball. But they pressed on. The explosions ripped open gaps in the German wire, and through those smoking holes, the Buffalo soldiers charged. Private Vernon Baker led his squad through one such breach and came face to face with a German machine gun nest. Without hesitation, he sprinted uphill alone, firing from the hip, tossing grenades into the bunker, and killing the crew. His squad poured through behind him. Baker's bravery that morning would one day earn him the Medal of Honor, though it would take America more than half a century to recognize it. To the northwest, Company B was scaling cliffs the Germans believed unclimbable sheer rock faces nearly 70 degrees. Using ropes and bayonets hammered into cracks, they pulled themselves up in silence. Captain John Rounin led the way. His gamble paid off. By 7:15, his men reached the summit ridge, becoming the first Allied soldiers to breach the Gothic Line's main defenses. Von Schellenberg refused to believe the initial reports. "Negro troops cannot have reached the summit," he barked. But as confirmation poured in from forward positions, disbelief turned to panic. He ordered a counterattack 120 elite mountain troops armed with flamethrowers and grenades. The fog had thickened again, muting sounds into chaos. When the Germans struck at 7:45, it became a nightmare of close-quarters combat bayonets, entrenching tools, even bare fists in the smoke and snow. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, already wounded, led his platoon into the melee. When his machine gun jammed, he seized a fallen German's rifle and kept fighting. Witnesses saw him charge a squad of enemy soldiers, bludgeoning them one after another before being cut down by automatic fire. His courage gave his unit time to regroup and hold the line. By 8:30 a.m., the German counterattack had stalled. Out of 97 men in Company B, only 31 remained standing, but they refused to retreat. When von Schellenberg's second wave arrived, they found American troops already entrenching on the summit. Lieutenant Hans Becker, the same man who'd once written home that "the Negro troops will die before our wire," was found dead among his own sandbags, his rifle frozen in his hands. His letter never reached his wife. Throughout that day, the battle for Monte Belvedere raged without pause. Fog, snow, and artillery fire turned the mountain into a gray inferno. The Buffalo soldiers held their fragile footholds under near-constant counterattacks. Every hour, fresh German squads stormed up from below, shouting "Feuer! Feuer!" as mortars pounded the peaks. But every time, they were thrown back. The American artillery, once scarce, now thundered in support. The 600th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black unit manning 105mm howitzers, fired over 1,800 shells that afternoon alone. Communication lines crackled with urgency. Forward observers, some clinging to frozen cliffs, called in coordinates by shouting over wind and static. The air smelled of cordite and blood. As the hours passed, exhaustion gave way to a grim rhythm. Men fought until their rifles overheated, then picked up weapons from the fallen. Rations froze solid, canteens turned to ice. Soldiers licked snow to stay hydrated, yet, amid the chaos, discipline held. German morale began to fracture. Prisoners taken later described disbelief at the Americans' persistence. One captured corporal said, "We thought they would break. They did not. They kept coming, like ghosts through the smoke." By sunset on December 26th, the first U.S. companies had secured parts of the summit. The stars appeared cold and distant over a battlefield littered with bodies. The wind carried no sound but the hiss of distant artillery. The Buffalo Soldiers had done what the Wehrmacht said was impossible. They had cracked the Gothic Line, but the cost was monstrous. The 370th Regiment alone lost nearly 600 men in 2 days. Dozens more froze to death before medics could reach them. Yet not a single platoon broke, not one retreated. Von Schellenberg, his command shattered, sent a final message to Kesselring. American Negro troops fight with unusual determination. We underestimated them gravely. Those words, intercepted by Allied intelligence, would circulate through high command. The myth of racial inferiority had collapsed, buried under the snow of Monte Belvedere. The dawn of December 27th revealed a nightmare frozen in time. The slopes of Monte Belvedere were littered with bodies, American and German stiff with frost, rifles still clutched in lifeless hands. The wind whistled through shattered trees, carrying with it the faint echo of voices, orders, prayers, moans of the wounded calling for medics who might never come. Those who survived huddled in shallow foxholes, scraped into the frozen rock, clutching their weapons and waiting for the next attack. Every few minutes, German mortars whistled down, shattering the icy ground and sending showers of dirt and snow over the men. Yet the Buffalo Soldiers held fast. Private Vernon Baker, his uniform stiff with blood, later recalled, "We fought until there was nothing left to fight with. When the ammo ran out, we used grenades. When those were gone, we used rocks. But we didn't move back, not one step." By noon, the 371st Infantry Regiment joined the assault, reinforcing the battered 370th. Through coordinated artillery barrages and infantry maneuvers, the Americans expanded their foothold across the summit. Forward observers established new positions, and by afternoon, Allied guns thundered in unison, blasting German counterattacks before they reached striking distance. Von Schellenberg's forces fought desperately, but the mountain that had once felt invincible was now a tomb. His elite grenadiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to surrender in small groups. A German lieutenant captured that day told his interrogators, "We were told the Negro soldiers were weak, but they kept coming, even when wounded. They fought like men possessed." For the men of the 92nd Division, there was no sense of triumph, only the numb silence of survival. Out of nearly 3,000 soldiers who climbed that mountain, more than 500 were killed or maimed. Company B, once a proud 97-man unit, now counted just 31 able-bodied soldiers. Still, they held Monte Belvedere through the night, fighting off sporadic attacks and enduring temperatures that dropped below freezing. When the fog lifted on December 28th, the American flag flew from the summit. The western anchor of the Gothic Line had cracked. But this victory was not just a tactical achievement, it was a turning point in history. It forced both the German command and the U.S. Army itself to confront uncomfortable truths about race, merit, and courage. A January 1945 intelligence report sent to Field Marshal Kesselring reluctantly admitted, "Negro American units display combat effectiveness comparable to white formations. Previous assessments based on racial theory are invalid. These troops exhibit high morale and tenacity under fire." For the first time, German officers began referring to black soldiers not as Negertruppen, but simply as Amerikaner. That linguistic shift, small as it was, marked the death of a dangerous illusion. Winter tightened its grip. By late January, the Buffalo Soldiers faced a new trial, Monte Castello. This was no mere hill. It was a fortress rising over 3,000 feet, reinforced after the fall of Belvedere. Snow blanketed the ridges, mines were reset, and German artillery zeroed in on every possible approach. The enemy was determined to restore what had been lost. But this time, the Americans weren't alone. Reinforcements came from one of the most decorated units in U.S. history. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans. Many of these men had families imprisoned in U.S. internment camps, yet they volunteered to fight for a country that distrusted them. Together, Black and Japanese American soldiers, two groups marginalized in their own homeland, would take on Germany's strongest position in Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller briefed the joint operation. "We are taking Monte Castello and holding it. I don't care how many counterattacks they throw, there's no falling back. No second chance. We stay until relieved or dead." The plan relied on surprise and darkness. The attack would begin at 4 a.m. on February 19th, with the 442nd striking from the north and the 370th from the east. Snow muffled their movements. Only the faint crunch of boots betrayed their advance. At 4:02, the first artillery barrage erupted flashes, lighting the night like lightning behind clouds. By 4:30, the slopes were crawling with moving shadows, soldiers scaling cliffs, cutting wire, planting explosives. The Germans, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. By 6:30, both the 370th and 442nd had reached the summit simultaneously. For the first time in months, German defenses cracked under pressure. Desperate counterattacks followed, but the Americans were already dug in, rifles and machine guns forming interlocking arcs of fire. Von Schellenberg sent a frantic message to Kesselring's headquarters. "Monte Castello lost. Negro and Japanese units fight with exceptional determination. Western Gothic Line compromised. Request permission to withdraw." The reply came back cold and absolute. Denied. Hold at all costs. But the costs were unbearable. German troops, demoralized and cut off, began falling back through the valleys. The psychological effect was devastating, not just for the Wehrmacht, but for the entire German defensive strategy in Italy. The Gothic Line, once considered impregnable, now bled from its western flank. American commanders realized they were witnessing something more profound than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic triumph over centuries of prejudice. One Allied war correspondent described it this way: "On those frozen ridges, the two most discriminated groups in the American army shattered not only German fortifications, but the walls built by their own countrymen." The final act came at Monte della Torraccia on February 21st. Clear skies for the first time in weeks allowed full air support. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German trenches, while B-25 bombers dropped 500-pound explosives onto fortified bunkers. Below, 3 American regiments advanced Buffalo soldiers shoulder to shoulder with the 442nd, climbing through flame and snow. By 6 p.m., the battle was over. German defenses had collapsed. The Western Gothic Line, once called Kesselring's masterpiece, was gone. Between December 26th and February 21st, the 92nd Division suffered 2,187 casualties, 419 killed, 1,611 wounded, 157 missing. Yet their sacrifice achieved what months of Allied offensives had failed to do. They broke the line that opened the road to northern Italy and ultimately to Germany's surrender. A captured German officer, shivering under interrogation, confessed, "We were told colored soldiers would run at the first shot. Instead, they climbed mountains under fire that would have stopped any other unit. They kept coming." I fought Soviet guards on the Eastern Front. They fought no harder than these Negro soldiers. That statement, entered into the official Fifth Army report, would echo for decades. With the Gothic Line shattered, the Italian campaign entered its final phase. Spring was approaching, and with it came the opportunity Allied command had waited months for. The path to the Po Valley lay open. The German army, once entrenched in its impregnable mountain fortresses, now retreated in disarray, pursued by soldiers they had once mocked as unfit to fight. On May 2, 1945, the German forces in Italy officially surrendered. The guns finally fell silent. But for the Buffalo Soldiers, the end of battle did not mean the end of struggle. When they descended from the mountains, they returned not as heroes, but as invisible men. The same soldiers who had conquered Monte Belvedere were met with silence from the American press. No parades, no front-page headlines. The U.S. Army's own after-action reports minimized their achievements, downplaying the scale of their victory. To many officers still trapped in old prejudices, the idea that black troops could outperform white units was unthinkable. General Mark Clark's official statement read with painful restraint, "The 92nd Infantry Division has performed creditably. Their success demonstrates that, with proper training and leadership, Negro troops can contribute meaningfully to combat operations." It was faint praise for men who had bled out on frozen slopes. The truth, however, was undeniable. Field Marshal Kesselring himself, no longer hiding behind Nazi ideology, admitted in his post-war memoirs, "The American Negro divisions in Italy fought with distinction. Our assessments based on racial theory were completely wrong. They demonstrated courage and endurance equal to any troops I faced in my career." That confession from the architect of the Gothic Line was more powerful than any medal. But medals did come decades later. 7 members of the 92nd Infantry Division would eventually receive the Medal of Honor, though 6 of those awards were posthumous. Bureaucratic indifference and racial bias had buried their nominations for 50 years. Only in 1997 did the U.S. government finally correct the record. At the ceremony, held at the White House, an aging Vernon Baker stood in front of the President of the United States. At 77 years old, his posture was still straight, his voice steady. He accepted his medal quietly, then turned to the audience and said, "This award is welcome, but it's 52 years late. 7 of us earned this honor. 6 had to die before America saw fit to give it to them." That tells you everything about the country we fought for and the country we came home to. The room fell silent. For a moment, history itself seemed to pause. When those men returned home in 1945, they found a nation that had changed less than they had hoped. In uniform, they were treated as liberators abroad, but in civilian clothes, they were reminded they were second-class citizens. Many were denied GI Bill benefits. Black veterans were barred from housing programs and universities that white soldiers entered freely. Private James Hicks, who had survived Monte Belvedere, was refused service at a Georgia diner 3 months after returning home. When he protested, showing his combat infantryman's badge and Purple Heart, police dragged him outside and beat him. Years later, he recalled bitterly, "I took Monte Belvedere, but I couldn't get a hamburger in my own country." That irony, fighting fascism abroad while facing racism at home, became one of the defining wounds of post-war America. Yet it was also the spark for change. Their heroism gave ammunition to a growing movement for civil rights. When President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9,981 inches, 1,948, desegregating the USA, armed forces, he cited the combat record of black units like the 92nd as evidence that segregation weakened the military. In that sense, Monte Belvedere was not just a battlefield, it was a battlefield for America's conscience. The years passed. Italy rebuilt. The mountains that once thundered with artillery grew quiet again. Today, Monte Belvedere is a peaceful ridge, covered in grass and wildflowers. But if you walk its slopes, you'll find the scars still there. Rusted helmets, twisted shrapnel, fragments of barbed wire swallowed by moss. At the summit stands a memorial erected in 1995. Simple, unadorned, bearing only the words, "They proved themselves here." Every year, small groups of veterans and their families gather there. They touch the cold stone, some weeping, some smiling, all remembering the men who climbed through hell to carve their names into history. Before his death in 2010, Vernon Baker was asked what he wanted future generations to remember. His answer was quiet, but it carried the weight of all who had fought beside him. Remember that we volunteered to fight for a country that treated us as less than men. Remember that we proved ourselves against an enemy who thought we were inferior while serving in an army that agreed. Remember that we took mountains white units had failed to take, then came home to a country that wouldn't let us vote. But remember, most of all, we did it anyway. We fought anyway. We proved ourselves anyway. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers of World War II is not just a war story. It is a human story about dignity, endurance, and defiance. These men carried more than rifles up those mountains. They carried the hopes of millions who demanded recognition, equality, and justice. In the winter of 1944, the Germans laughed when they heard black soldiers were coming. By the spring of 1945, their laughter was gone, buried under the snows of Monte Belvedere. The Buffalo Soldiers had the last word.